Through interviews, expert discussions, and narratives, we uncover pathways to resilience, innovation, and evolution. Welcome to All Things Change. Aloha and welcome to All Things Change podcast. I am Jenny and I'm with...
I'm Olani. Hi, everybody.
And today we are going to be talking about Indigenous communities and philanthropy. And with us today is Sandra Mitrovic. She's with the Native Counts Coalition. Rio Fernandez, he is with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. And James Tucker, who is also with Native Counts Coalition. So, hi, thanks for joining us today, everybody. I know everybody's running in different schedules and it's been a week. Thank you for taking your time. Let's see, whoever wants to jump in first, if you could share a little bit about yourself and the organization.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Rio Fernandez. I'm an enrolled member of the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe. I live in Seattle, Washington, spent most of my life here in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm really excited to be here. I am the Director of Civic Engagement with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. I work really closely with our more than 50 urban Native nonprofits that work to advocate and increase the visibility for urban Native people in particular. And a lot of the work that we do is focused on how do we get these organizations resources, how do we help them do civic engagement work, and then in regards to this, how do we increase the amount of philanthropic funding going to them, their presence in philanthropy, all that sort of stuff. I think that we're urban Natives in particular are very often overlooked, not considered, especially when people are thinking of that don't have experience with Native communities. When they think of Native communities, there's a very Hollywood, very specific idea I think people that don't interact with Native folks often have of what Native people are. And so the NUIFC exists to kind of counteract that messaging and put our own face out there and kind of highlight the beauty of urban Native America.
Great.
And hello, everybody. Hey, Tanani Niki. I'm Sandra Mitrovic. I am citizen Time Maidu and descendant Yamani Maidu in Northern California that live and learn and reside on the Numu and Washoe lands in what is Northern Nevada. I come to this coalition working with Native Counts Coalition on behalf of Native American Rights Fund, a large organization working on and protecting, I should say, and uplifting various different rights and protecting sovereignty, including civil rights, and including also, I would say, a lot that went into this project as it relates to data protection, talking about kind of what Rio talked about in terms of visibility for Native people in a lot of our work that we do, how our communities are able to grow in healthy and safe ways. A lot of that is tied to resources and how we're able to make sure that we're leveraging resources to fund different things in our communities, from housing to education. I myself worked in student affairs and higher ed for over 15 years, and then working as a tribal grants administrator and doing so many different things to work on how do we pull the appropriate story together. I know we're going to talk about a little bit about that today as it relates to philanthropy, but how do we pull that really beautiful story about Native communities together, whether it's Native communities, as Rio mentioned, that are urban. I'm an urban Native. I live off my tribal lands, or those that live on tribal lands. What does that look like? How are we ensuring that those communities are supported and taken care of? And a lot of that is driven by the ways in which we're able to support all of those infrastructure projects. And so the sprint we're going to talk about today, and we're very thankful that Changemakers was a partner in that, is how do we do that with our communities? How do we make sure that they have the capacity to ensure that they are provided with and given access to all of those allocations in terms of funding that will help their communities grow in a good way. So excited to be here today, just to be a part of the conversation and also.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jim Tucker. I feel like I'm really overdressed, but I do want to point out it's a little colder here in the DC area than it is in Hawaii, just a tad. I'm actually comfortably dressed for where I'm located. I'm one of the conveners of the Native Count Coalition. We started it in 2019 in advance of the 2020 census, largely because we found that there were many unmet needs in Indian country, especially when it came to the decennial. The two biggest ones, candidly, that we encountered were a lack of language access that the Census Bureau was just simply not providing, And the other thing is just basic outreach. You can't run campaigns that are just focused on television or radio or things that you can do remotely. You have to do it in person. And it's just such an oddity because so much of the Census Bureau's work in Indian country for the decennial and even for the American Community Surveys in person, but they just simply didn't cover a lot of what we identified really needed to be done for the census. I've worked on census and voting issues going all the way back to the 1990s. I feel like kind of old now. I don't know, but and then I will also say that one of the other things that I did in my capacity with, I was the pro bono voting rights counsel to the Native American Rights Fund for 15 or 16 years. One of the things that we identified early on was that you can't redistrict and you can't bring voting rights enforcement actions or any civil rights enforcement actions if you don't have good data. And so for that reason, NARF sponsored me to join the National Advisory Committee of the Census Bureau, where I actually served as chair the last 2.5 years that I was on the NAC. There is a huge need in Indian country. That need is often not met. I know that's what a lot of our conversation is going to be. And I'm looking forward to having the discussion because for those who don't know, working with Indigenous communities as a funder can be quite a bit different, and it really needs to be tailored to the community to really be effective. So looking forward to the chat.
Awesome. Me too. Thank you, folks, for being here. We got to meet you, most of you, from the Top X sprint that we did with the U.S. Census Bureau, which I really, as it continues, hopefully encourage people, particularly Indigenous communities, to participate in, to see if you can't get your project. Our project didn't get accepted, but we kind of got to work with you folks, which I thought was better for us because it provided more context than just our little bubble. And it has definitely led to exciting work and projects coming up based on the work we got to do with that Top X sprint. So anybody listening out there that's interested, go check it out. They do well, last year they did have an Indigenous specific sprint, and so an opportunity to apply. And hopefully that continues and remains with them and in the sprint because it was very helpful. But should we get into sort of our discussion, Jen?
Yeah, sure. Sure. I know, right? Wah, ha, 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 ha. So, one of the things, when we think about Indigenous communities and philanthropy is just how do our underrepresented represented communities traditionally practice giving and reciprocity? Because I know we're very different in a very good way. Did anybody want to jump in?
I'll jump in really quick because I'm actually working with a group right now. I spent this past weekend on some lands, Nisenan lands in Northern California, and I spent time on a tribute trail. The tribute trail was also, it was fundraised private philanthropy also in the community that I was in. And I wanted to understand how the tribe there had really worked together. Urban collective of Native folks had worked together to really talk about land back in a good way. And what they really had to lean on was philanthropy because they are a tribal nation that is state recognized in the state of California, but not federally recognized. So they were really working together as a collective to find ways for this land back initiative, but also doing that within their own community. They have a cultural center. They were able to put language in the community so that it's visible. It was just a really beautiful story. And so when I think about the way that they were able to do that through private foundations and also community, That's kind of how I look at that idea of reciprocity. They worked with community, they lived in community, but they also are working on a relational project with my tribe. My tribe is a federally recognized tribe, and so together, and we're about an hour and 15 minutes away. Our lands are about an hour and 15 minutes away from them. But our traditional ecological knowledge crew was called in to work on some of their land, and so together they're creating this collaborative partnership. And so whenever I think of this idea of reciprocity, I think about how are we continuing that story together collectively. How are others around us being impacted by who we are, what we're hoping, or how we're hoping to move forward on our path, and what are all those intersections going to be? And so their story was a great story when I was spending time this weekend on their lands to learn how they were doing that in a collective way, because they knew that there was a larger part of an ecosystem that they had to tap into. And with that larger part of the ecosystem, they then were able to expand into additional resources of support. And I think that's what that's all about. How do we do that in a sustainable way? How do we, many of us, and I'm sure Rio can attest, Jim can attest, we all can attest, one-time funding doesn't work, right? We know that. We have to create sustainable approaches. And so I think them creating that ecosystem was a really great story of reciprocity, bringing collective groups together.
That's amazing.
And I guess I'll jump in just
Yeah.
real quick, just to follow up because you made some great points. I think the other thing that has struck me about Indian country, for those who are not keeping tabs, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. You have dozens of additional state recognized tribes, and then a number of tribes that are in the pipeline to get one or both of those. And I think one of the things that has struck me just in working in Indian country is that so many of them, hundreds of these federally recognized tribes, are invisible. And they're invisible to funders. You're talking about some of the most geographically, linguistically, culturally isolated populations in the country.
Yeah.
It's not difficult. It's very difficult to get out to them. Funders won't go out to them. There's always an expectation among funders that the potential recipients or applicants are going to come to the funders. Well, that's difficult to do when you don't have broadband access, when travel is limited, when travel is restricted depending on what time of the year it is, whether or not your road is washed out, whether or not you have a road if you're in Alaska.
Yeah.
And I think that just in terms of collaborating together, one of the things that really lifted up so many tribes during the decennial and since then has been that they realize that we really have to work together, that a funder's not going to give a tribe, a tribe of 150 people, $1,500 that may make a significant difference in getting an accurate count. But what if you get 50 of those tribes together or 100 of those tribes together, working together and, putting together a proposal and, working through oftentimes either national or regional organizations like the ones that we have, on this chat, because that's what you really have to do. And it's an unfortunate side effect, I think, of just the funding process is that the tribes that tend to need the funds the most are also the least situated to actually get those funds. And that's one of the challenges that collectively I think we've all been working together to overcome.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a huge challenge. I know that's even though I think Native Hawaiians have a little bit more visibility. I mean, you just say Hawaii and people, they get excited. So we have a little bit more visibility, but uh, at the community level, we still struggle with figuring out how to connect to philanthropic and then having the capacity, because there is expectations on philanthropy side about how you come to them, right, and how you engage with them. And so having a lot of community organizations, I think, are passion driven and solution oriented, and have some very innovative ideas. Is just making that connection and having the capacity to meet the expectations, I guess, of the philanthropic organization. So we face those challenges as well, um, when it comes to that. I was wondering, James, to go back with your expertise in data, which is very important when you are trying to look at like what's going on in your community, how you communicate to potential funders is a very helpful tool to have access and to know how to craft that. Could you talk a little bit about like your experiences in working with Native communities and data? I know you work big level, but and maybe even Rio too, and Sandra too, like how you bridge that gap between all this data out there and communities who are trying to access it because it will help them tell their story.
Sure. So I guess I'll start off by saying that I think one of the things that we all have to recognize and acknowledge is that there is a vast set of resources in terms of data out there, but it's very limiting. It can be
Mm,
very limiting. And the other thing that we certainly are very cognizant of is that it undercounts in a very gross and disproportionately negative manner. But not just people who live on tribal lands, but even urban natives. And I think that was one of the things that really kind of got us to, really push forward and propose the Top Sprint project to begin with, is because the data that is out there is so often inaccessible to the very people who need it. Because one of the things that funders want is they want to have some of the raw data to explain, okay, well, what's your justification for this?
right.
What is your need if you're applying for social services funds? Well, how many people are below the poverty line? And the thing is, oftentimes the data itself may tell part of the story, but the bigger story tends to be if you just get down and talk to the folks in the village, like how many people are in the housing development? How many people do you know are getting, assistance, whether it's, tribal assistance, federal assistance, state assistance? What does that look like? Why is there a need for it? What are the economic opportunities in your community? And so I think that's one of the things that we're always struggling with, is that on the one hand, we want to make the data that's out there more accessible and usable for people, and in a format that they can frankly get at it, which is not always the case with census data.
Yeah.
Certainly, anyone who's gone to data.census.gov and you're confronted by hundreds of thousands of different tables and iterations of data, and your head just starts spinning, and you're like, how do I pull this together? But then the funny thing is, oftentimes when you look at that data, you notice two things. Either there's an undercount, or a lot of the data is suppressed because we're dealing with oftentimes very small populations. So for privacy reasons, the Census Bureau is actually doing the solid thing for the community that they're required to do by federal law. And they're suppressing the data, and you just want to tear your hair out and say, I really need this. But if you're talking about like rancherias in California that may have dozens of people, dozens of citizens, or you're talking about a small Alaska Native community with 175 people, the data may be out there, but it may not be available to you. So I think that's the other thing that we're always struggling with, is how do you thread that needle, and how can we bridge that gap? And that's why, again, it's so great that we're having this conversation, because a lot of funders just don't realize that they oftentimes are dealing with very large, more monolithic populations. These are far from monolithic, and in much of Indian country, it is far from a large population that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think with the NUIC, the work that we do, particularly focusing on urban communities, I think that in one of our original taglines, one of the things we really talked a lot about was this idea of making the invisible visible. And so for urban Native communities in particular, you have a city, a large county or something like that, and you're looking at a population of 1,800,000, depending on the city, could be quite large. And a small portion of that could be Native. And we have had many experiences with our organizations of supporting them, providing them information from either ACS or census data so that they can go to a lot of the work that we do is around working with elected officials, working with legislators, working with government officials to try and increase funding for these organizations. And we've had organizations go meet with people and talk to them, explain to them, there's this many urban natives in this area, in this region, in this county, and have them talk about how the elected official is just completely surprised, has no idea there were natives in the community, had no idea there were 50,000, 100,000, a substantial number of them. And we know, especially for us through this electoral lens, that a lot of close elections are decided on those margins. They're decided by 1,000, 5,000 votes. So every little community that can be engaged really does make a big difference. And so we know that when we're able to kind of connect with elected officials, when we're able to connect with those in power and present to them this information that, again, Jim was talking about, making it accessible, being able to provide to these organizations, there's not usually like pushback to it. It's just a level of surprise for a lot of people. And so, we have an organization in Detroit that, joined the coalition a few years ago and has really been able to be a beautiful test case for what this theory of change that we have about how important organizing can be and how being, putting yourself out there can be. And now, they've qualified for grants that they didn't have access to before because they have this information and because they can go and they've developed those relationships with state officials, with county officials, city officials, and stuff like that. And now they have that relationship that so many other organizations have had for so long, where they have someone in a position of power that knows who they are, that can give them a call, that they can give a call to and speak with. They've gone and presented to different at different events and all that sort of stuff, and they really are kind of a great example of what we believe about that, making the invisible visible, like coming up, talking about who you are, and showing how much you can do with the little resources that we've been given, and kind of being able to push that idea that we can do quite a lot with a limited amount of resources because we've always had to. But think about what we could do with even a modest increase in that kind of funding.
Yeah. In your response, I heard you sort of rattle off some really key strategies around accessing funding, things that you can do, or I guess that Detroit project did in order to be able to get funding to increase their impact, right? That I think I want to kind of slow down around that because I thought that there's some real gems there that I was like, wait, that's some good information. But could you go back and maybe dive a little deeper into, is it Detroit, you said, right? Dive a little bit deeper in how they used coming together and using that data, sort of opened up avenues for them to access funding to support their work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's kind of two levels to it. The first is just outright talking with people and explaining to them that there is quite a large urban native population in Detroit. I think obviously, like we had talked about, there are tribes, I believe federally recognized tribes in Michigan that kind of are, when these elected officials, when people think of native communities in Michigan or Detroit, it usually, I would assume, the thinking is immediately to that reservation community, those tribal communities, with very little thought about the amount of native people that would live in Detroit. And so that's kind of the first part. So just being able to teach these individuals who are almost always open to this information. It's not I don't want to learn about this. I don't believe in any of this. It's I had no idea. I wasn't unaware. This is fascinating. We haven't been reached out to by your community before, or when we have, it hasn't gone anywhere. But being able to sort of do that sort of support with that. So being able to just flat out say, we are here, we've always been here, we're going to continue to be here, here's how we can work together. And then I think secondly is, I had mentioned our organizations are, like I think so many native nonprofits around the country, are operating on pretty limited amount of resources, and they're able to do a lot of different stuff. So this Detroit organization was able to join, I believe it was a coalition of other Detroit nonprofits, and has been able to kind of work together with those organizations. They recently were able to open a food bank through funding and receiving funding to kind of install a new refrigerator, kind of refrigeration unit, so they could really grow their food bank program as well too. And that's just the sort of stuff that they were able to get because they started speaking with elected officials, because they got connected with elected officials. Those people then were like, oh, who you should talk to is so and so in this program. We've been working with them for a little while. I think that there's definitely some overlap there. And that's, I think, for us with these, for the NUIFC, the native nonprofits in urban areas, that's another really big thing that we push, that we had kind of talked about earlier. We are always looking for more partners. We're looking for like-minded individuals, like-minded organizations, other communities that know that feeling of being overlooked, not thought about, and stuff like that. We all kind of need to stand together and work together. And this is a big part of what the NUIC and all of this sort of coalition building is so paramount about.
Yeah, awesome. So we kind of got started in talking about like what are the most effective ways to build relationships between Indigenous communities and funders. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe expand on things that you've done or you've seen that are successful, I think a couple of things I'm hearing is that it sometimes is helpful when you band together, when you come together and you tell a story that's maybe larger than your 124 Native Alaskans in rural Alaska. But you come together and you have a more, I guess, a story that stands out. But are there any other strategies you've seen that are successful to sort of open the door? And I'm thinking particularly when it relates to like large philanthropic organizations. What have you seen? What are the strategies that Native communities are employing that are successful?
So I'll jump in. One of the things that I think that some of our communities have had to do was out of necessity. I would say in California, one of the projects that we're working on, and we've seen a lot of this recently due to wildfire and disasters of wildfire. And in our restoration crews, traditional ecological knowledge crews, many of those groups have started to form coalition. They've not just start, but they have been and have formed coalitions. And to Rio and Jim's point, many of them have done this out of necessity, needing to pull together, needing to come together in a way because there weren't a lot of resources. People were trying to figure out how do we, an emergency response system, respond critically and directly. Not all tribes, to Jim's point earlier about capacity, not all tribes, especially smaller tribes in California, rancherias, not all of them have their own emergency disaster plans or SCRPA plans or all of these other plans. And in order to draw direct funds from FEMA, you do typically have to have those emergency disaster response plans. And so when you're building those types of things, those mechanisms, those plans, again, this goes back to capacity. And so many of these communities got together after some of the large California wildfires. My tribe, many other tribes in our surrounding area in Northern California, lost vast amount of their communities to these fires. They had to really come together and start talking through in collaboration, in partnership with state agreements, but also through philanthropy foundation work to start really having a strategy around how do we rebuild these communities? What does this look like in terms of hazard and food mitigation projects? It was going to take, they knew it was going to take a multi-pronged approach because it was affecting so many different communities, not just Native, but others. And so I think that strategy of pulling together in a time of disaster goes back to our kind of discussion about how can you pull together data points. They had to do mapping, physical mapping, GIS mapping. We see that in the census, right, too, when we're talking about mapping, especially with tribal lands and addressing. But they had to really pull together all of these resources, and not one entity was going to be able to cover the cost of this. So that's where you see I think also groups coming together, coalitions coming together in the time of disaster where they had to lean on this multi-pronged approach, pulling from state funds, pulling from federal funds, and then also bringing philanthropy dollars into the community that were already here, by the way, but that were looking for a way to expand into spaces that, maybe they hadn't quite thought about from a forestry perspective. One other thing I'm just going to layer in there too is youth and elders. One of the things in Native communities a lot we talk about is youth and elders in terms of philanthropy, and philanthropy talks about how to fund future generation, but also kind of existing language and culture. A lot of these revitalization projects and resilience projects as relates to climate resilience and land, they are looking for prevention strategies as well. And so many of the philanthropy and private foundations came in and said, how do we also tie this into prevention strategies with building healthy communities with youth? And so a lot of the funding too is layered there. And I always remind people of that. Look for those other opportunities, those other communities within a community, right? That philanthropy might be looking to serve, but they're not quite sure how that fits within the larger project. And we were able to create youth prevention within traditional ecological knowledge as a safe space for youth to participate on the land.
Nice.
So I guess I'll just add there are, especially looking at it through the lens of what do you need to do to get a funder to kind of get what's happening. I think there are three pieces to it. One is you have to overcome stereotypes. There are stereotypes that oh, the tribes have casinos. They're so well funded. They've got natural resources in Alaska. They have all this money coming in. The federal government has all of these programs. They get free healthcare through the Indian Health Services. All of these things that are not, it may be true in some places, but the vast majority of Indian country, it understates what the need is and how that need is actually being met. The other thing that's tied directly to it is the need to educate funders about what Indigenous tribes are all about. A lot of them look at it through the lens of, oh, well, we're going to treat American Indians and Alaska Natives like we treat every other racial and ethnic population group, and they look at it through the lens of race. They don't look at it through the lens of a political identity that is in a government to government relationship with the United States, that there are trust obligations. They don't know what that means. They may have heard the word. They don't understand what it means, that there are requirements under federal law that we have to take care of, the Indigenous peoples by treaty. It's required. And I think the other thing that goes along with it is that when we have tried to educate some funders, in some cases, we have very receptive funders that we spend days and weeks and months with, and they will finally get it. The light bulb comes on. But the third part of it is really more important than the other two in a lot of respects, which is the funders actually need to get out to Indian country and experience it for themselves to see what the problems are. There's only so many times that we can try to explain about rural addressing problems in the Navajo Nation.
Right.
But when they go out there and they see there are no street signs, there are no house numbers on houses, that when you are describing a house as being 3 miles down, BIA route 3, you go past the gully, look for the dead burro, and it's just up the hill. That's an address in Indian country, and they don't understand that, and they don't understand what the impact is of not having that traditional address. That all these great outreach materials that the Census Bureau does, that other governmental entities do, they don't reach that destination because there's no address there. And so I think one of the most eye-opening experiences that we've seen, and this has been true with a lot of the senior census staff, is when we actually get them to come out to tribal lands and they get to see for themselves that when we're talking about geographic isolation and we're talking about weather issues and they're trying to land in a remote Alaska Native community, and they can't get in there for 3 days because fog prevents them from taking off and landing, they finally start to get it. And that's, and the same thing with the language barriers. And the lack of literacy among a lot of the elders, that we've tried to communicate that one of the things you have to take into account is that we've got literally decades, if not hundreds of years of educational discrimination that is so pervasive that you see the elders are still suffering the effects of that today. It's not because they didn't want to, it's not because they didn't want to go to school. They didn't have a school to go to. Or if they did go to a school, it was not a place that they were going to have any kind of conducive learning, that they were going to take away anything other than this so-called educational institution is out to destroy my culture and my identity. And so I think it's really taking those things together. And I think the other big part of it is getting funders who were actually willing to recognize that they have to go through these steps, so that we can help them overcome the stereotypes, educate them, and bring them out to Indian country, or bring them out to urban, areas, so that they can see, like with the importance of what NUIFC does is so much of the Native community that may be in a metropolitan area can be very divided, and they bring people together. They have community centers that serve the same function that you might find a tribal council building serving on the reservation. And it's so important, and so often funders just don't understand like how important those tools are for bringing people together.
Yeah. And then you kind of like add on the whole layer of trust, right? And can I trust you? And how, it really is about, which is the fundamentals of fundraising, is relationships, and trying to provide those avenues for the funder and the the community to have and build those relationships, which trust is a hard thing to kind of get over. But like you said, over time, right? It can happen. Awesome.
Well, because that trust doesn't just kind of naturally pop out of a vacuum. That
Yeah.
is, years of generational trauma that
Yeah.
has kind of informed those responses, and then trying to then be in a space to be like, okay, we this is what our community needs. We need to move forward, and so we're going to
Yeah.
go ahead and put our faith
Yeah.
and trust in you. Yeah, it's difficult
Yeah.
for sure.
I like your idea about like getting funders to go out into community to see, like you said, what an address looks like. Um, I'm wondering, are there other strategies you think that could be helpful in really like decolonizing philanthropy? Or even if it's not that, what ideas, when I say that term, what comes into your mind? And again, what have you been working on if you have been in that area? And maybe what things are you seeing are working well when it comes to decolonizing philanthropy? You got something, you ready to go, Sandra? Go for it.
Well, I'll go really quick because I'm sure
Yeah.
Rio and everybody else has stuff, but we actually just did this with a group and Jim hit it right on, like on target. So we're working with a philanthropy group on a project, and this is a committee that I work with. And one of the things that we're working on is how do we bring them into our riverways and our river systems, to be able to actually spend the time in space, because there was a lot of, as I mentioned, after the fires and everything, people were willing to throw, here's my biggest thing, people are willing to throw money at something but not really truly understand it. And so to Jim's point, if it's not just as simple as writing a check, right? There has to be a true understanding of what it absolutely takes to build this infrastructure over time. And so oftentimes you may have someone that comes in and they're like, oh, we're going to fund it for a year or 2 years, but not really realizing that it's going to take X amount of years and it's going to
Right.
take X amount of people. And so the project we were working on right now is the starting point of that, where it starts with actually community working alongside funders on a river system, where they're actually going to spend the time in community together. And what we're hopeful of that is for those collective stories to be shared, because some of them are from the region, but also some that are from outside the region, to understand the larger perspective of all riverways and all communities and how they intersect and come together, right? Water, as we say, water is life, but truly it's for everyone, in this story. And so we really strategize to say, put the funders in the conversation on the ground, but then also to that end, let's not just see money as this, here we're going to write a check,
Right.
right? That's not the end all be all. There's another investment that has to come into the, bring it back to the top question that we had at the start of the podcast, was reciprocity, right? What are we all willing to put in and to be able to get to that end goal? And it's not just going to be one thing that we're able to put in. It's not just going to be a dollar amount. It's not just going to be supplies. It's not just going to be maybe even people power. It's going to be a collective of things. And so I think that's what I'm really excited to see out of this river project that's happening. The other thing that's going to come out of that is a curriculum. And that's the other part of reciprocity. What are we willing to give back education wise and knowledge gathering wise? Because how are we willing to do this so for future generations, we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. We're going to just keep building on that pathway so that they can keep going.
Love it. Any other
Well, I,
thoughts or ideas?
I was just gonna say, I think the other part of this that feeds into exactly what Sandra was talking about is that um, oftentimes the philanthropy model has developed over time to be very top down model, and that may work with some communities and some populations. It does not work in Indian country. One of the things that we see is it has to be very much a bottom up, and you can't have a system where oftentimes a funder has like a goal that they want to achieve, or they have line items that they want this and this done. They want these reporting requirements. What they need to do is they need to sit down with the native organizations, with the tribes, with the community-based organizations, and they need to actually, the first thing they should do is just listen to what the need is, and listen to how can that money actually be utilized in a way that's going to be meaningful. And to Sandra's point, one of the things that we've seen with voting, with GOTV, the mistake that's made among funders for the get out the vote drives in Indian country is they think it's a one-off, that we can just send out, we can have Native Vote go out there or do GOTV 3 or 4 weeks before the election, and then we don't have to come back out for another 2 years or 4 years.
Right.
And it has to be continuous, because we are dealing with populations that simply many voters simply do not have a habit or a culture of participating in non-tribal elections. It's not because they're apathetic. It's because of the lack of trust. It's because we had when we were doing the NAR field hearings in Sacramento, we had a whole panel that the entire time, these were folks who were members of Northern California tribes. They were talking about the collective trauma of having ancestors who were slaughtered by soldiers, and basically to that day that trauma still exists with them, that they don't want to participate in non-tribal elections. They view it as some the other thing oftentimes that we really have to work in terms of trying to educate is that there's a sense that they're going to give up their sovereignty by participating in non-tribal elections, that they're somehow acknowledging that there's a government that's superior to their tribal government, which is not true, that you can do both. And I think that that's why it's really necessary that, that the funders really have to sit down with the organizations and actually just hear them out on what do you need? How do we achieve that? Because if you don't do that, it's just simply not going to be effective. And I think the other, I guess my concluding point with this is that it's because Indian country is not monolithic. What works for one tribe, you can have a tribe that's 30 miles away and that won't work for them at all. You have to really adapt it for each individual community. And it is much more resource intensive. It's more time intensive to come up with a plan that works. But you can't just do this one size fits all model that we're going to do this and we're going to put it and it's going to work and we're going to have a great outcome in Indian country, because that's what's been done. That's why we continue to see, even with the census has made a lot of inroads, but we still saw almost a 6% estimated undercount on tribal lands, which was the highest of any population group in 2020. And that's why, because census uses a one size fits all model and survey, and it just doesn't necessarily mesh with Indian country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Jim. He made a point earlier about, for obviously NUIFC's, one of my main focuses is that civic engagement, is that GOTV work. And we've had so many conversations with people that are skeptical about voting, that have voted once, didn't vote again, that kind of thing like that. And when we approach, or when civic engagement, when get out the vote is approached in this transactional way, where we'll be here for 2 months and then maybe we'll be back in 2 years, it feeds into this cynicism that I think is polluting the kind of the broader country, the broader political engagement with stuff like that, where people feel like, well, my vote really doesn't, like, it just doesn't feel like it makes an impact. And one of the biggest things over the last couple of years the NURC has been implementing, on top of trying to fund throughout the year, but is also this idea of how do we organize in off years? How do we organize when there aren't elections? Because that's actually when we can really kind of like close that circle for people of being like, okay, we voted, and now you guys are going to be able to see an investment into the community that wasn't going to be there, and we're going to keep the pressure on. We're going, it wasn't as simple as getting this person elected. It wasn't as simple as having this person come to an event on October 21st and have some food and chat with a little bit. It's February. Where are you guys at now? You've been sworn in. What are your focuses now, and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is like a civic engagement can't be as simple as you have a day in November that you vote and that is the end of that work. It has to be built out, and if it doesn't, doesn't, then people will continue to have this cynical feeling. People will continue to have this negative, they're just here for my vote and stuff like that. And then what are you supposed to tell them when all of the data backs that up, when all of our experience backs that up?
Yeah.
If these organizations, these funders are going to approach the same way, which is like, we fund for 2 months, we fund for 3 months. So it's like, well, then you're just here for this one portion of it. Then you're not here to actually see this work all the way through.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
That's
in it for the
interesting
long
that you
haul,
say that.
right?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sorry.
Jen.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, and then that's a big issue too, is getting people to realize that, sure, you're going to come out at those time periods, and you'll need to be able to come out throughout the off years, but not just coming out for, a hi, how's it going? But like actually creating an authentic, genuine reason for being there and showing that level of engagement with the community and not seeing it as such a transactional type
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of, I'm in a community political action group, and there are no Native Hawaiians. I'm the only Native Hawaiian in that group. It's predominantly white. And they're asking me, how do I engage? How do we get more Native Hawaiians in this? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, because when I talk to my community, everybody right now is just sort of sitting back and saying, like, let it burn, because we want our sovereignty back. All these years we've been fighting within the system. We've tried to make these moves. It has not, we've gotten some, but it's just very incremental steps. We are not bought into the system. And so, what is the skin in our game around this now? And so I don't know how, and I don't think I can or want to bring my community into that very specific political action group. I'm just trying to get out and do different things, but I know my community will organize itself when it's ready to organize itself in whatever fashion, because it has within its own needs and its own like context. When it feels threatened, or when it feels it needs to come into action, it will. It's not because we're not active. It's just we haven't found the impetus right now to be active. But when that time comes, we will engage. It's just very, with the shifting sands around the current politics, it's very interesting to see that conversation going on, and we'll see what happens. Awesome.
One thing that I
Well,
noticed too, even within our Native Hawaiian community, is that it's in terms of action, it reminds me kind of like a simmering pot. If the lid is on, it's just gonna go and go and go and
yeah,
go and go and go and boom, and then we're just gonna be like, okay, we had enough. We're gonna, step up and show out for a particular issue, and then we're like, okay, we've got that. We were heard. Okay, right on. We're gonna go back to
yeah.
daily life.
I mean, but there does come a part where they're like, hey, we want to take the next step. Let's engage other
Mhm.
people. Let's engage. We want to go to the next level. Now's the time to bring in government funding. Because on the other
Mhm.
hand, like, I think that the government is due our money. Like, we are due some financial reciprocation. And that also comes from philanthropy. But we're almost, I think, we're over our time, and we don't want to keep you folks
Sorry,
too
like to
long.
keep you too
But
late.
I just want to like thank you folks for your insight, definitely. And I hope to have further conversations with you folks about maybe ongoing partnership and work that we can do to bring our different Native communities together, to create a larger voice and a larger playing field. So I hope that our conversation, this is not the end of our conversation and us
No,
getting to
not by any
work
means.
together. Did
And then
anybody have any?
really quick.
Oh, go. Sorry, Jen.
No, I'm sorry.
I keep over talking you.
I know, I'm just like all excited.
Mhm.
I was going to say, if everyone could kind of quickly just let us know where people can find you and your organization and your contact info, if you whatever you want to share.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. So Sandra Mitrovic, and actually, I'm consultant as well. So you can actually just find me at my regular email. I don't know how that pops across the screen, but sandra.mitrovich@outlook.com. And I just want to say something, Olani, that you just said, which is how do we stay in community together? And I think what we're doing right now. And I know we didn't go really far into the data stewardship part, but that is something that we can help each other with, is to make sure that we don't have any gaps in supporting one another. So, but yeah, you can reach me there, and also working with our Native Counts Coalition with Jim and Rio. Super glad to work with both of them throughout the whole census redistricting, ACS, and voting rights work. We're a coalition together, and so it's really exciting to do that on behalf of the Native American Rights Fund, and really the work that I think lots of organizations are doing together. So thank you.
Thank you.
The NUIFC is just NUIFC.org is the website, and then Urban Indian Communities on social media platforms. I think we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And then obviously, if you need to contact me, my contact information is on the NUIFC website. It's really easy. It's just riof@nuifc.org. And we're always interested in being reached out to. Our quick to return emails, and we're always interested in organizations that are interested in kind of being a part of the NUIFC's vision of helping create thriving urban Native communities. So yeah, if please learn more about us on our website and our social media.
Awesome.
So, and I guess I'll just close it out by saying we're actually developing a website. It will be going live soon, but it's going to be nativescount.com. It's all one word, nativescount.com. And it'll actually have the contact information for all of us on this. And the other thing I will say is that what we're planning on doing, it'll be a slow rollout, but we're planning that this is going to be a clearinghouse for information, just generally lessons learned that we've had, ongoing things, events that are coming up that are that affect Indigenous peoples, primarily census, but other things. Federal Register notices when they come out, when they're released. If there are reports, we'll have links to partners. There'll be information, contact information for the folks from census, including the tribal relations specialists, all of that. So we're really excited. We'll be more excited when it's actually formally rolled out, but just keep that in mind and keep an eye out. If it's not up yet, it will be up soon.
Awesome. Look forward to seeing
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah, very. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your busy day with us today to record the podcast. We truly appreciate it. And thank you to everyone out there listening and watching. If you did like this, make sure you like it, subscribe. You can find more information about Changemakers at changemakershawaii.org. And until next time, hui ho.
Hui ho.